All right, everybody, welcome. This is it's our final night installment in this series. However, next Sunday, I'm going to do one more night session just as a launch to the next series. So the next series is on the book of Matthew, and I'm going to just talk about kind of the background of the New Testament world. So it'll be bigger than just Matthew, which is why I'm not doing it on the Sunday morning. We'll probably have a little bit of introduction on that Sunday morning. But if you're enjoying the more nerdy, we'll call it, side of Bible teaching, I invite you back next Sunday night as well. So tonight, we're talking about the reliability of the Bible. Can we trust it? How can we trust it? How does our text compare to other ancient texts of similar age or comparable age at least? How does our theology compare to other world religion theologies about our own text? And we're just going to see some fascinating things, I think. But let's start with a fun quote. First one's from Da Vinci Code. Teabing cleared his throat and declared, "The Bible did not arrive by facts from heaven. I beg your pardon. The Bible is a product of man, my dear, not of God. The Bible did not magically fall from the clouds. Man created it as a historical record of tumultuous times, and it has evolved through countless translations and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book." This other one is from Bart Ehrman, who's a favorite of mine. Whenever I need like a poster child for heresy. So this is from his book, Misquoting Jesus, where he's defending the Gnostic Gospels. It says, "The earliest period of textual transmission was also the least controlled. That would be the time right after the apostles wrote what they wrote. This is when non-professional scribes, for the most part, were copying our text, making lots of mistakes in their copies. My contention is that Christian scribes who opposed adoptionistic views of Jesus modified the text in places in order to stress their view that Jesus was not human, but also divine." So adoptionism there is the idea that Jesus is not born divine, that he was simply a person, a good rabbi, a good teacher who was adopted by God, commissioned by him, as it were, as the Messiah. So there's no virgin birth, there's no divinity. And so he's saying the people who oppose that view during this sort of loosey-goosey phase were able to kind of write their views into the text, and that is the text that we have today. So I'm going to take on both of these, and we're going to have some fun. So let's just think about how our early texts, what are some other comparable historic texts? Oh, thank you. So these are various authors: Caesar, Tacitus, Thucydides, Homer, and then the New Testament. And these are the dates that they're written. So these are all somewhat comparable. You know, Caesar is 1st century BC, Tacitus is 100 AD, Thucydides 5th century BC, Homer 9th century BC. And so look at the date of the earliest copy. So all of these are not all of these, but these are kind of around the window from our vantage point, around that sort of hinge point of the 1st century. And the earliest copy, look in that category. We have 900 AD, 1100 AD, 900 AD. We don't really know about Homer. And then the New Testament, I'll show you one of the earliest fragments that we have, is from 117-ish. And then look at the number of copies.
Pretty good.
That's staggering when you think about it. I mean, really. So there are more manuscripts of the New Testament than there are of any other book from the ancient world. More doesn't make it more correct or right or anything. I'm just simply pointing out, when we're talking about the uncertainty of early times, look at the other books, if we apply a similar level of criticism to, look at the other books that we have to throw out as being uncertain and unclear as to, can we, is this what the author said? We have older manuscripts of the New Testament than any other text in the ancient world. So if you think about the New Testament being written in the 1st century, and some of our earliest copies or fragments are from the early 2nd century, that's really staggering when you think about it. I mean, Caesar's 1st century BC, 9,000 AD, that's 1,000 years. And here we have it within essentially potentially the lifetime of the authors. And not just this, we have, these are various texts. Don't get I'm not trying to wow you with the names or anything. I just am more focused on the dates, right? There's something called the Bodmer Papyri that dates to 200. Codex Vaticanus dates to 325. Codex Sinaiticus dates to 340. So these are other codexes of compiled texts of the Bible that are dating very, very early, that are still dating before our first copy of Tacitus. And so they're still within, a very small window of time from the original events and from the original writing down of these events. And so it's not just that we have older texts, though. We have earlier writers. So the writers who are the eyewitnesses, who are writing about the things that they saw, are writing within 20 to 30 years of the events, compared with the 1,000 years later for a lot of other texts. And so the New Testament is written down very, very early. There are some people who take a very late date on the various books of the Bible. I take an early date. One, it makes sense with what is being said inside the book. Two, there's some external evidence. So there's a very important event that happens in AD 70, which is the temple's destroyed. Basically, the Romans say, wipe Israel off the map. And they do. They did their best to erase every semblance of, they killed people who were living out in the desert. And so people either ran away or were enslaved or were killed. Those were kind of the three options. So you would think if you were writing down something and didn't mention the fact that the Romans came in and killed a whole bunch of people, then it probably means that it was written before AD 70. And there's no book of the Bible that talks about the destruction of the temple, Masada, or any of these other events that for them would be like our 9/11. They would be that big. So if you think of it this way, if you think of Luke would have been written before Acts, and Acts does not mention the fall of the temple. So if we start with Acts, Luke comes before that. Most scholars agree that Mark is written even before Luke was. It was the first gospel to be written. And so now we're starting with 70 AD as the benchmark, and then we're working backwards from that. We're getting to see that the date is very, very early. Just by comparison, what we know about Alexander the Great. Think about the facts that we know about him. How young he was when he conquered the world, the extent of his campaigns. We understand this from two historians that came between 300 and 600 years after his life. They were not his own eyewitnesses, his own historians, his own biographers writing his life. These were two people who came much, much, much later. It would be like you or I producing a biography of George Washington on the early side of that, right? I don't know. I'm not an Alexander the Great. She asked if is the tale of Alexander the Great orally passed down. I don't really know. I'm not an Alexander the Great scholar. I would assume it's had to be oral for a while, but still. Anyway, that's just some comparison. So you go, no one is sitting here doubting. I don't know if a 24 or 25-year-old conquered the known world. I don't know if that's true. No one's saying that. But if we were going to say that, we're saying, the biography about Alexander the Great's life is 300 and 600, the two different writers, 300 and then 600 years after the events themselves. If we're not willing to doubt that, why would we look at the Bible and say, these events are written within 20 to 30-year period of the actual event? The texts are transmitted within that short period of time. It's incomparable. There is not another work in the ancient world that has that level of, that has that kind of track record. So one of these fragments, this is actually a photograph of the earliest fragment we have of the scriptures. This is called the John Rylands fragment. It contains part of John 18:31 to 33 on the front and 37:38 on the back. It's hard to date exactly, but it's somewhere between 115 to 150. Now, I've already said I take an early date on the books of the Bible because I think AD 70 would just be burned in anybody's mind, and you would not write a book on Judaism without including the destruction of the temple. In fact, the first person to write on early Judaism, Josephus, writes about exactly that, the destruction of the temple, the death at Masada, and all of the other goings-on of the Roman Empire throughout the Holy Land. So he's kind of a case in point of if you're writing about history at that vantage point at that time, you're not going to not mention it. So think about this. For some people who date John, some people date John to AD 90 or even 110. Well, if John wrote the Gospel of John 80, 90 to 110, which I don't think he did, but just follow it for a second, and the John Rylands fragment is from AD 115 to 150, somewhere in that range. I mean, take the early date on the John Rylands fragment, the late date on the writing of the Gospel of John, and I mean, gosh, you might be looking at the autograph right there. I mean, that's how close we're talking. Remember the other chart. The other chart for any other ancient book was 900 years, 1,000 years, 1,100 years after the event of the writing. So we're talking about apples and oranges here. It's just two different things. Another major discovery was the Dead Sea Scrolls. That is the Isaiah scroll there for you, and that is that's cave number 4, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. There's actually tons of caves back there. I took this picture on our last trip, just tiny plug. If you're not busy in 2026, May 1 through 10, we're going back here. You can get your own picture here. So I'll just throw it out there. But this was discovered in 1947 by a Palestinian shepherd boy. He's just chucking rocks like a kid does, throwing them into a cave, and he hears some pottery break. And it kind of scared him off for a bit, and then he goes back and starts exploring and finds just scads of these texts rolled up in jars. And there was essentially a group called the Essenes. I'll talk next week in our New Testament introduction about who are they and why are they hanging out in the desert. But they were hanging out in the desert. There's nothing else around here for miles. The Dead Sea's right behind us, and it looks pretty, but it's not like you can drink the water or live off the land here. That's kind of what it looks like right there. And so they're living out in the desert, just really trying to stay out of Rome's way, out of the sort of the worldliness of the city. They're trying to stay out of its way there. And so they were copying down these texts. They're one of the communities that did a lot of the scribal transmission that we're going to talk about. So these scrolls, I mean, these are hundreds of scrolls that are found, fragments, complete scrolls. These contain every single book of the Old Testament except for Esther and Nehemiah. These scrolls are about 1,200 years older, so closer to the events of the happening, than the formerly oldest text at that time was the Leningrad Codex. So it's 1,200 years older than that. The really cool thing is that this allowed scholars to check their work. So we could take the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, and we could take some of these scrolls that are found, and you can open to chapter and verse and go, how did they do? Because we've had something that's 1,000 years after that fact, and we have something 1,000 years before. Let's lay them back to back and see how they did. So we actually have a very fascinating checkpoint. This discovery solved a lot of debates in a lot of liberal biblical scholarship. People were saying things like there were 2 Isaiahs. Some would say written by different authors, neither of them being Isaiah. They just question everything about it because up till that point, there was not a single text found with one book of Isaiah in one complete scroll. They only had ever found 2 distinct different scrolls until this finding right here, and you were looking at one scroll of Isaiah. And so all of that is based simply on the theory, sort of the linchpin of that argument was, well, we've never found one that has both sides of the book, so it's clearly 2 books written by 2 different people. If one of them really is the Isaiah, then the other one is just some kind of imposter. Well, this really settled that because here we have one in the same penmanship from one source. So this solved a lot of other issues. It brought up other issues. It's not necessarily a slam dunk, but it did just give us a really deep look at history. So here's another set of perspectives on some early texts. These are different books. So we have the Iliad, that's Homer's writing. We have the Mahabharata, that's an Indian epic. Look how many lines are in the Mahabharata. That's 124,000 lines. And then you have the New Testament, which is about 20,000 lines. So let's talk just about accuracy. Now, let me just be clear. As I said this morning, what we say when we say the Bible is without error, we are speaking of the autographs. Now, the real challenge to that question, which I did not delve into on the Sunday morning, was we don't actually have the autographs, Old Testament or New. What we have are copies. And so the question really does come down to how well were they copied and can we trust this process? For Bart Ehrman and for Dan Brown, it's completely up in the air and it's anybody's word goes. I don't think that's at all very accurate. But you can just look right here and we can say, well, they're more accurately copied than any other manuscripts from the ancient world. So the Iliad has 15,000 lines. About 764 of these lines are in question. So this could mean where there were differences in texts. This could mean where texts had been corrupted. They might be missing a piece of a text. And so people have to write that in. If you read any of the great classics, especially from, ancient Mesopotamia, a lot of them are missing portions. So the Enuma Elish and others, they're missing portions of the text. So some of that happens. So there's about 764 lines in question. Look at the Mahabharata. That's from a very different part of the world, but an ancient text that is copied down. There's about 26,000 lines that are in question. They're either missing or in question. Look at the New Testament. The Mahabharata has more lines missing than there are in the New Testament. So the real question in terms of the New Testament comes down to about 40 lines. 400 words to be specific. That is the part that's in question. Now, if you have come up with the view of like, well, the Bible's true, maybe if you're coming from a King James background or something, please don't let this shake your faith. There's not a single major doctrine. There's not a piece of Jesus's life. There's none of this that relates to anything, I would say really, that would create some kind of alternative perspective that's in question in any one of these passages. So I'll talk about some of these passages in a little bit. So they're just simply more accurately copied. There are more writers attesting to the same event than any other book in the ancient world. So if you look at the writers of the New Testament, you have about 9 different writers who wrote 27 books. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, Peter, James, Jude, and the author of Hebrews. If it's not Paul or any of those previously named, then that adds one more to the list. Again, what do we know about Alexander the Great? 2 biographers, hundreds of years later. Here we have people who are within the time of Christ that were his disciples, walking with him every day, who have written down their accounts. Now you go, okay, well, great. How is that any better than the Book of Mormon? Open the Book of Mormon, and the Book of Mormon is Joseph Smith is wandering through the woods. He finds these gold plates. He's allegedly illiterate. And the angel gives him something, and he is able to translate these into English, which is the Book of Mormon. There were 6 or 8 other witnesses who saw this event. The angel came and took the plates back. We now have no more plates. All we have are the word of these 6 witnesses that they saw Joseph Smith tell this story. That's what we have. So you go, well, how is this any better than that? We have 9 witnesses who are all Jesus's, best buddies. They walked around with him. Maybe they're covering for him. Okay. We have 12 sources outside of the New Testament. We have 12 non-Christian writers who write about the life of Christ. Now, I'm not saying they're believers, and I'm not saying they would affirm the theological statements that I believe about Jesus, but they're intriguing. These writers, these 12 writers and their documents range from AD 52 to AD 200. They affirm things such as, number 1, that Jesus in fact existed. I find that not that many people question his actual existence. They might question the theological claims about his life. They validated things like he was known to be a virtuous person. Again, this doesn't mean they believe those things. They're simply quoting that is what is said about him. That he was worshiped, that he had disciples, that he was a teacher, that he was crucified, that there was an empty tomb, that his disciples believed the resurrection, that the story spread, and that there's persecution. So far, these 12 writers are doing better than the Jesus Seminar. So that's a tall list of things for them to say. Again, they're not saying, I personally believe in the resurrection. They're saying, here's what all of the report that we're hearing is that there's an empty tomb and that he was raised. That's what his disciples said about him. And so, again, show me an ancient work from this time period that has that many eyes, that has that many documents, both from the followers and outside the followers, where in those days you could have gone and questioned or scrutinized or contradicted. If anybody wants to contradict the resurrection of Jesus, it's about half of those 12 are Roman writers. They would definitely want to say No, there was no empty tomb. Here's the bones, here's the body. Everybody, shut up and get back in line. That's what they would want to say. And yet, these are the sources we have. I see. Okay. I hadn't added a feature, but I'll just put all that up there. So what about the differences? This is something that gets touted a lot, that there's thousands upon thousands of differences. And now let me say, to a degree, that statement is factual. There are many differences from text to text. The question is, what do we do with those, and what kind of differences are we talking about? So one of the first differences we see, this is particularly an Old Testament problem, this is where there's vowel changes. So here's 3 consonants. Remember, Hebrew is a triconsonantal language. Every word has a 3-consonant root, is what that means. And remember, the vowel points didn't get added till the time of the Masoretes. The Masoretes were, 400 or 500 years before the time of Christ. Okay, they added them because who wants to read a book with no vowels? That gets very difficult. And here's a case where DBR, if you add an I and an E as the vowel, it's dibber, which is say. If you say debar, that's word. And if you say deber, that is plague. So 3 very different words. Now, for a moment, you go, oh, well, this, does this prove Bart Ehrman's claim that everything was up in the air? Well, no, not really. Because if I were to write someone a note that I say, I have a nice, and I just put DBR, or I put a misspelling of this, or it was copied down and later there was a misspelling of it, if I said I have a nice blank for you, none of us would have filled in the word plague, right? So is it a difference? Yes. But based on being able to take 2 different texts and compare them, you go, okay, it's clear what's happening here. Also, context gives us clues and common sense gives us clues. So yeah, there's a vowel shift, but that's essentially what a lot of the vast majority of those changes are. Now, some of the other things are things like simple copying mistakes. There's a whole science built around this. I'm giving you there are people who've written dissertation after dissertation on the topic of textual criticism. If you're struggling with sleep, I can recommend one of them for you, and you won't struggle anymore. It's some dry academic writing, and this is coming from me. So a lot of these are simple copying mistakes. It's things like a mistaken letter, where a letter could look one of 2 ways. Also, we're talking about thousands, particularly again in the Old Testament, we're talking about thousands of years of history, and so the language actually morphs quite a bit. There's a verse in Ezekiel which says, it's talking about the Messianic times, it says, he will put a mark on their heads. And in the English translation, it says he will put a mark. It uses the word to indicate something, a mark. But in the Hebrew, it actually has the letter tau, which to us looks like an N with a weird hook on the end. But actually, fun fact, if you trace back Hebrew letters as they have changed over time, okay, English letters have changed over time as well. I showed you some of those ancient Bibles and the English, Middle English, it's unreadable for us as modern English speakers. The same thing is true for Hebrew. Trace that letter T back over time, and it starts uncurling from that upside down or from that N kind of shape and eventually straightens out, and it actually looks like a plus sign. Fascinating little fact. He's going to put a cross on their heads. So there are mistaken letters, there's substitution or similar sounding words. We have the same thing in English where you hear a word and it sounds the same as another word with perhaps a different meaning. Sometimes there's a duplication of a word. A lot of us today probably do this. So you're typing something out, and thankfully we have a word editor which will put that little misspelling red line under the second time we say the, blah, 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 blah. And it lets us know that we've made a duplication. But again, you look at that and it's very clear from a simple proofreading to go, oh, that's a mistake, that's not intended. Sometimes there's a reverse of a word order. Sometimes Hebrew is interesting in that it has a triconsonantal root, and so you add prefixes and suffixes to indicate person, number, gender, case, time, all of those other kinds of things. So I can't do this in Hebrew nearly as cleanly, so I'll do it in Arabic, which is also triconsonantal. So if you were to say Brian drank, you would say he, sharib, he drank. If I were to say Christy drank, I would say shribti, she drank. But if you were to say Brian will drink, you'd say hashrib. So you keep hearing that shrebe. You keep hearing that in the middle, hashrib, shrib. And it just kind of like dances around musically. So because of this, sometimes there's a reversal of a word order based on a beginning of a word or based on, again, these are all different categories in higher level renditions of this. Sometimes based on the beginning, on a prefix, sometimes based on a suffix, just because certain things kind of rhyme and you actually get into a sort of meter and a kind of pace with language. And then in some cases, there were omissions, a time where a word is left out. Now, there's a number of additions, or the question is, were they actually additions? One of these is Mark 16, 9 to 20. So if you have any modern translation, they'll probably have a little line or a bracket there, and it will say, the verses 9 through 20 are not in the original text. Now, they copy those and they keep them in your Bible, but they're not in the original. And so what they're meaning is they have found older and older texts that don't have that. Through this science of text criticism, they're able to look back and go, okay, the oldest text we have doesn't have this passage in there. At some point, this passage starts getting written in the margins, and they can point you to that text. And then at some point, it goes from the margins into the text. And sometimes some of these question passages gets put in different places and inserted in different places until later it's where we have it in our modern Bible. But here's the thing. Biblical scholars are very aware of these things. This is not, this might be news to us, but it's not really news to everyone. I don't think that one is original personally, and it's just based on how Mark reads. Mark is very to the point, and he's very quick. He keeps using the word immediately to carry his case along. I don't see him embellishing and adding stuff very often. And if you read it the way it ends, if you ever saw The Passion of the Christ, the Mel Gibson one, it ends exactly like Mark ends. And I don't know if you remember this, but there's the resurrection scene where, the light comes, the stone rolls away, and you just see like a foot step out of the thing and then end. And it leaves you with this wait, I want to see what happened. What did he look like? Was he, there's that sort of feeling. And I think Mark, if you read it without those sections, it actually reads like that, where there's this, he walks out and then boom, end of story. And I can just see his listeners going, wait. So, tell us more. We want to hear the rest of this. Okay, the other one is John 8, 1 through 11. And this is the passage where the woman is caught in adultery. Jesus sits down and writes in the sand, and he says, look, he who's without sin, let him cast the first stone. Again, this is one of those where it made its way from the margin, from not being there to a margin to in the text. I think that kind of follows the same logic as Mark 16, that it probably is added. And the final one is John 5, 7 to 8. So I have this in the original 1611, the King James. It says, for there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one. And there are three that bear witness in the earth, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and these three agree in one. Now, that section in the brackets, this is what is called the Johannine comma, so the John's comma. There's a comma statement there, and then this is inserted, and then there's another comma. It's pretty clear this one was added. It was added, I think, for the sake of clarity. And this is one of those verses where if you've ever struggled with, is the Trinity taught in Scripture, this is kind of the aha, boom, here it is text that people like to go to. So I agree with the theology of the clarity. I just don't think it's probably not original in there. Now, you go, well, does that mean the Trinity's not biblically set? No, not at all. I mean, I would argue it's from Genesis to Revelation. We see it on all of the pages of Scripture just about. The word itself is never used in Scripture, of course. But the idea of God is both three persons, but one being only. Hear, Israel, the Lord your God. The Lord is one. We don't need a clarifying statement saying these three are one. Just put all of Scripture together and systematize that, and you get a sense of each Father, Son, and Spirit are fully divine, and yet there's only one God. It's a mystery. We cannot solve it, and yet it's what the Bible teaches. So I don't think we lose anything. I don't think we gained anything by the addition. I don't think we lose anything by taking it out. I like that Bibles keep these things in and put footnotes. I think we should be careful. if I were preaching, man, if I were preaching through Mark, I mean, I would probably teach the last set of verses anyway. I don't find it. I don't know. There's a sense of like, what if I'm wrong? You know, like, I don't want to not teach God's word. But there's also this sense where I'm pretty sure that this is just an addition. The addition is in line. Like we learn no new theology in this passage that we don't have in any other version of the resurrection. So there's nothing contradictory or anything like that, which is why I go, well, whatever. So textual criticism, it has done a lot of harm. In that a lot of people use textual criticism to try to say, well, the original, the author who stated in the book, he's not the one who wrote the book. It's somebody else at some other time. And for some, text criticism has done that. But text criticism is also what's helped us see that when a word is copied twice, this should not shake our faith. And so that is actually a useful side of it. And so I think it's like anything. If you have a non-faith version of philosophy or of theology or of theology, and it will lead you down a certain path. If you have a faith-based version of those things, you will probably be strengthened in your faith So here I have, on the one side, we have the Quran. And this is the process for how the Quran is. I'm sharing this just so you can see a comparison of why text criticism can actually be a helpful thing. So the story of how the Quran is formed is Muhammad is an itinerant preacher for a while. He would fall into these trances. Modern day people think he probably had epilepsy or something. But he would fall into these trances and he would start kind of spewing things. And his followers, once he had followers, would kind of pick up whatever scrap of whatever they had lying around and would start writing it out on that. So if it was a piece of leather, they'd write on leather. If it was a piece of broken pottery, they'd write on that. So they just had kind of stacks of this stuff. And then later there's 4 schools. So that's what those 4 squares represent. There's 4 different schools. They're geographic, but 4 different schools of Islamic thinking and theology. Just like with Judaism, just like with Christianity, they began copying their own texts. But they're starting with sort of a pile of, sticky notes, as it were, and now they're trying to compile into a text. So if you read the Quran, it does not read, even though it contains some historic elements, it does not read in a chronological fashion. Granted, there are certain non-chronological portions of the Bible, but pick any book, it reads kind of from front to back. Well, the Quran is simply organized the largest book down to the smallest book, which actually helps you build momentum as you're reading, because kind of by the time you're getting bored, it's like, well, it gets easier and easier the further in you get, So essentially, there's this guy named Uthman. Uthman is born in 576, dies in 556, and he's one of the caliphs. A caliph is the Islamic equivalent of a pope. But a pope, back in the days when they had like real power, when they had armies, and they could wage war and depose kings and all that other, all that other stuff. So that's what a caliph was. Uthman is the 3rd caliph in Islam. And he, because of his ability to travel now, there's a little bit of time, a period of peace and prosperity in Islam, he's able to kind of travel around, visit these different Islamic schools, and he starts looking at the Quranic texts that they're copying, and he goes, wait a second, there's a difference. And there can't be a difference because this means God is saying 2 different things, and this is God's word, and so what do we do? So Uthman takes it upon himself. He gathers up all of the scrolls, and I don't know if he did it personally or maybe he had a team of people helping him, but essentially they compiled an authorized version. Well, what do you do with all of the other texts that you have? Throw them in the fire, which is what he did. So if we were to look at this critically, we would say that what we have today is Uthman's understanding of what the Quran ought to be. And we have nothing to check him against. You either take it or leave it. Interestingly, a group of scholars found a text from Yemen that had some other stuff written on it, and they did some X-ray analysis on this, and they found that whoever used that text, writing implements are hard to come by. The leather, the parchment, all these different things are very hard to come by. So a lot of times they would wash it and they would reuse it. This is one of those things. And so what's currently written on it, I don't even know what it is, but they're using kind of like some X-ray scanning, I don't know, to see what was written previously on this, and it turns out that it's a Quran. So they are busy transcribing and translating that That is not a group of Arabs, that's a group of Germans doing that, obviously, not Arabs. But it seems to be an older version of the text that does not represent what they currently possess. If only they had all this other text, they would be able to apply some textual science and figure out where it came from, but they can't. On the other side, we have the Bible. So there were three kind of main sources for where these texts were, where these texts came from. One was Palestine, just locally there in Israel. So you have things like the Samaritan Pentateuch. That's only the Pentateuch. It's just the first 5 books of the Bible. You have the text from Qumran, which is what that second one is. Then you have a Babylonian. This is from the exile. This is where the Masoretes start really copying and transmitting the text a whole bunch. And so you have a second stream of information. Then you have a third coming out of Egypt. This is the Septuagint, the LXX. That's what that is. So we have the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Qumran text. We have the Masoretic text, and then we have the Septuagint. So we have 3 sources combined to look at things. Now, the Septuagint is in another language. And so already there's, like just the difference of translating from English to another language, you come up with small differences. But from these 3 sources, these fed into a single standardized text. Now, the fun thing is we have about 5,000 manuscripts and pieces of manuscripts available to us, which means were you to take the time to learn Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, and the other, half dozen languages that some of these things are in, you would be able to go yourself and do the study yourself. You don't have to take my word or any author's word for it. You can actually go find where these are at in particular museums spread throughout the world, look at them with your very own eyes. More than that, there's 36,000 quotes in the early church fathers' writings. And so that begins within the lifetime of the disciples that some of these writings start coming about. John disciples Polycarp, Polycarp disciples Irenaeus. Irenaeus was one of the biggest writers, Christian writers of his day. He wrote volumes. And so even if we were to take away all of the modern day Bibles, all of the ancient Greek texts, we could compile or reconstruct 99% of the New Testament we could reconstruct just from their quotes alone. So go back to those quotes at the beginning and go, is that at all a tenable position? Absolutely not. That is just the most fanciful retelling of ancient history, which is not actually that ancient, but. So just to kind of summarize some of that, there are more manuscripts of the New Testament, more in existence than any other text in the ancient world. There's older manuscripts of the New Testament than any other text in the ancient world. There's more accurately copied manuscripts than any other text in the ancient world. There are more writers attesting to the same events than any other book in the ancient world. And there's earlier writers attesting to the same events than any other book in the ancient world. That's a staggering list when you start thinking about it. Again, this does not, if you're skeptical in the room, that's fine with me. This does not mean that ultimately what the Bible is saying is true, right? That is something that I believe on faith. What this does say is that in terms of a text and in terms of history and in terms of preservation, if I'm going to doubt the Bible, I basically am going to have to doubt everything I think I know about the ancient world at the same time. I can't doubt the Bible exclusively and then accept wholeheartedly every other thing that we read and we learn. Again, the Bible, if it's accurately copied and it's accurately copying fiction, okay, there's your get out of jail free card, I guess. But so again, like the fact that it was accurately copied does not mean its claims are in fact true. The claim that Jesus is in fact divine is something that we believe on faith, right? It's not something that is I can prove with science. We can go back and look at the text so we can prove its accuracy to go, that is what the first disciples were in fact saying about Jesus. That is what they taught about him. What will we choose to do with that information is the question. There's certain non-textual, so we've been looking at like the textual factors of why can we believe the New Testament, but there's certain non-textual factors, or we could call them social factors. Number one, stories would have taken on a fixed form. I mentioned this a couple weeks ago in talking about how its formation happened. But these stories would have taken on a fixed form that wouldn't really have changed to the degree that there's something called the Synoptic Gospels. So the Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And there are so many papers and dissertations written on which came first and who borrowed from who. But there's very clear sharing and borrowing amongst the three, which I would say proves that they took on a fixed kind of form. This shouldn't shake your faith. The three guys knew each other, so there's a reason they took on a fixed form. Kind of like if you sit around a family member, you might, hear them make one joke and then you hear a different family member make the same joke. And, of course, they sit around the dinner table and they made that joke together one night, and that's why you hear it from both sources independently. The disciples could not have corrupted the stories in the face of eyewitnesses. That's a huge thing. Peter, the passage I quoted this morning where he says, look, we were eyewitnesses. He's immediately throwing out, if you're looking for the rope to hang him on, he just handed it to you. Unless he's actually telling the truth, because you're going to go ask the other eyewitnesses, which is exactly what Luke says that he did. He says, look, I went, I did my research, I talked to the people, here's what I found. There's extra biblical corroboration. I've already talked about that. The disciples are persecuted and killed for their stories. You're not going to be killed for a lie. There's the principle of embarrassment. It's fascinating. The writers left very difficult passages intact. They didn't try to necessarily to harmonize their accounts. We try to harmonize their account. Our Christmas Eve service is going to be a little bit different. We're just following Matthew. And actually, as the creative team together, worship team together, and we had a conversation of, do we just want to stick with Matthew, because I'm about to be going through the book verse by verse, or for the sake of Christmas and telling the whole story, do we want to harmonize? Because Matthew tells elements of one side of the story and Luke tells the other side of the story. And most people prefer Luke's because it focuses more on the actual birth. We're going to take just Matthew, and it might even feel a little jarring for some of us if we're used to having this sort of harmonized view. So we harmonized the story, but the writers themselves didn't feel like they needed to harmonize the story. If they were trying to hide the truth about Jesus, they really did a poor job covering up the truth. You see Jesus' humanity in the story. So if you were trying to prove, he's divine and not human, these guys really did a bad job. We see him being tired on the boat while his disciples are afraid for their life. If they're trying to make him appear to be divine, that's not the way to do it. The writers left in a lot of incriminating evidence in the text. This is kind of like the principle of embarrassment. The principle of embarrassment means you're not going to tell something embarrassing about yourself unless it's probably true. And so the fact that we see the writers leaving in this incriminating evidence or this embarrassing stuff, this is like the most poorly executed conspiracy in all history if it really was a conspiracy. We see that Thomas, one of his disciples, doubts that Jesus has risen from the dead. We see Peter, wanting to follow Jesus on the water and sinks like a rock. Peter gets called Satan by Jesus. He denies Jesus 3 times. The women are the first ones to discover the empty tomb. They're the first to kind of get it when it comes to this is what he meant, which we don't have any problem with that in today's world. But in ancient world, the testimony of a woman was not considered valid in court. And so if you're trying to convince a skeptical world about your claims, you wouldn't say, well, the first people who understood this, the first people who said, come see the empty tomb, is a bunch of women. That would not have been convincing to a first century audience. No one was smart enough to know that Judas was the betrayer when he's sitting there at the table. Kind of a big oversight if you're trying to sell Jesus the man as Jesus the God. The fact that he was outsmarted by somebody sitting at the table with him. So this is, these are certain just kind of social factors where you go, if we were to examine these people kind of using more from a courtroom perspective, we would try to verify their story, we would try to corroborate their story. There are certain things that we would do, and we see a very different side of this that are not just textual questions, was the story copied well, but does it make sense? the fact that their stories line up and don't contradict, but are not corroborated, like word for word. When you start hearing, I mean, if you go home and your kids are giving you a line, oh, my kids are in the room. I shouldn't teach them how to beat the system. Kids, close your ears. When you come home and you ask what happened, and every child gives the same exact story, what do you know? Coached. Probably one of the older kids said, now look, little siblings, mom and dad, they're going to come home and they're going to say this. We need to stick together. We need to all have the same story. Memorize this. These are the words. And like when you start seeing that, you realize, oh, there's coaching. There's not coaching. I mean, Matthew is all going to, but he is going to all but leave out the birth of Jesus. It's actually kind of frustrating. And you go, wait, this is not where he and John and Mark and Luke all just sat together and go, okay, let's get our notes straight. On the other hand, they don't tell a conflicting story. Their facts line up with each other. And so from just a legal standpoint, we say, well, this is true. So here's conclusion. These are my bold claims. If we can't believe the Bible, we pretty much can't believe any event from the ancient world. If we're going to doubt the New Testament, we pretty much have to doubt every ancient event from the New World. If we're going to be consistent, at least, if we doubt the Bible and not these other things, we're simply applying a standard to the Bible, which we don't apply to other documents. And so it comes in under the guise of being, open-minded and don't just believe what's fed to you. But the reality is, it's just kind of a special pleading. And then finally, if we can't believe the Bible, we pretty much can't believe any event from the ancient world. That was the first one. There's duplication error. But we spotted it because you're now all cultural special. You're not textual specialists. All right, I tell you what, I'm going to give you one more little piece and then we'll go to Q&A. So here's something when people read the Bible, I think this is important. Number one is we have to pay attention to the genre of literature. When you pick up a newspaper, you are getting multiple kinds of information. You are getting stories that are historic, that this is what happened. You might get the announcement of new laws in there. You might get the announcement of people's deaths. You might get some humor and some comedy in there. You might get experts talking about what they think might happen in the next business cycle or the next political cycle. You get some futuristic thinking. And you know, because you're a sane, self-aware person, you have common sense, you know you don't read all of those sections of the newspaper the same. You probably aren't consciously doing this. It just is common sense to you. To go, well, when the headline is that somebody, brutally murdered this guy on the street, the newspaper's not condoning that, right? The newspaper isn't saying, well, this is what ought to happen. Hey, people, go out and do this. It's not saying that at all. It's just saying, here's what in fact happened. We're simply reporting you what happened. Now, when there's a new law that might be announced or discussed in the newspaper, well, it probably does mean this is for you to follow and to obey, and we're making you aware so that you don't wind up in trouble with the police. When there's something that's poetic, we don't break it down. We don't parse the words. Roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. Like we don't take those words and over-parse them. We go, what's the feeling that's being transmitted by these words? And with apocalyptic things, when we talk about what is future and coming, like it's hidden sometimes in poetic language. And so we go, well, do we take that literally? Do we take that figuratively? Do we do a combination of both? So with a newspaper, we do that. And simply with the Bible, we also have to do that. This is where a lot of critics of the Bible go, oh, the Bible condones, mass rape, murder, genocide. And they just go down this list of things like, condones or talks about people doing them. Again, the Bible is not a big cover-up scheme. If you want to know that the guys in the Bible are bad, just read the Bible. I mean, David slept with Bathsheba and then murdered her husband to try to cover it up. There's no text in the Bible which is like, hey, that was right. And so we have to be careful. Like when we're reading a narrative portion of the scripture, we just have to be aware the Bible is simply letting us know, oftentimes in ugly detail, here's what actually happened. These are the details. Abraham, great guy in some respects, terrible guy in other respects. And you could just take the next person's name and say the same thing about them. And so paying attention to genre is a huge thing. Paying attention to the text. Texts are written in human language, and they contain things like irony, exaggeration, figures of speech. Moms in the room, how many of you have said something threatening to the life of your child? Don't raise your hands, please. This is being filmed. But I'll take your laughter as an admission. Right? It's hyperbolic. It's not meant to be literal. If they're not dead, I'm going to kill them, right? I remember that one. Right? It's not meant to be taken as a literal legal statement. It's hyperbole. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your hand causes you sin, cut it off. Why? This actually emphasizes the human element of the Bible. As Christians, sometimes we want to make it, or as critics, people want to make it so divine that it can't contain human thought forms or human language forms and patterns. And that's a huge problem. There's a human side to the book, and things like irony and exaggeration, the figures of speech, like these are evidence of them, and we have to be aware of these things and interpret them wisely. Fascinatingly, there's one interpreter of early scripture. His name is Origen, a brilliant person in many respects, but his whole method of interpreting the Bible was to take this allegorical approach. And it means that, like, if Jesus crosses over to the other side, or if they catch 157 fish, he's going to have a reason for what does 157 mean, and what does the other side mean? It's like, it means he got in the boat, he went to the other side, they caught some fish. That's what it means, right? But I take a historic person as like it's just face value. He would take them very allegorically, except for that one passage about if something causes you to sin, cut it off. He is most famously known for self-castration. So for being an allegorical guy, the one passage you took literally, a bit of a miss there, Pay attention to the context. Context is such a huge thing. People will pull scriptures out of context all the time, where you go, that's not what that says. I remember reading a book, it was a missions book, and there's a verse from Habakkuk, I'm just paraphrasing here, but it's like, just like watch and see what God's going to do. You're not going to believe it even if you were told. Like, yeah, God's gonna do something awesome, and we wouldn't believe it even if we were told? Man, that sounds, what's he gonna do? And when you read it in context, it's like, the Chaldeans are coming, they're gonna destroy everything. Like, it was this like doom and gloom. It wasn't like, rah, rah, this is gonna be a great day. But it was just like put on the front of this book as like, we're about to show you something awesome that God's gonna do that you wouldn't believe even if we told you about it. So context is very, very important to understanding. We can't just pull things out and make it say whatever we want. People do this all the time, and it's a problem. Pay attention to the author. The author tells us something about the text. Why are they writing? Who are they writing a particular thing to? The occasion matters to helping us understand why things are important. I mentioned this in the chapter 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient, love is kind. It's the chapter that everybody reads at a wedding. If you had at your wedding, I'm not throwing any shade. But when we read all of Corinthians together, it's a very corrective letter. In fact, both Corinthian letters are very corrective letters. And the two that he references are also very corrective letters. And the ones that later church fathers also wrote to the church at Corinth were also correct. I mean, it's all correction for them. So it's not how we bring all this together to say, well, it's not that that he's giving them hey, great job, guys. He's saying, here's the ways that you're failing. Here's the ways that you're not living this up, because you know how you're not kind, love is kind. You know how you're not patient, love is actually patient. And he's essentially telling them through very poetic forms, you're not being loving. And then finally, pay attention to ourself. We are reading from a particular vantage point. We have cultural lenses on. Most of us in here probably come from individualistic cultures. And so when we see the word you, we think me individually. A lot of those yous are in Texan and they're y'alls. A lot of it, when it talks about us or the faith, or when you start reading who it's really about, you go, wait, this is a collective category that the writers keep using again and again and again. And so something as simple as that, of growing up with individualistic thinking, can really reshape and can misshape how do we understand things like the gospel? Is the gospel Jesus died for me to save me from my sins? Or is it Jesus died for the world to save them from their sins, to bring his kingdom to them? it's a very different story. The Bible can never mean something that it never meant. This is where we have to be careful. There's a ton of pressure on preachers and teachers to do this. We always have to keep it engaging and interesting and, fresh and relevant. We use all these words get thrown around. If you wind up with an interpretation of Scripture that has never been discovered before, chances are you're wrong. It's actually, historically, it's kind of an arrogant position to think there's been 2,000 years of church history, and even longer when we factor in the Old Testament, and to go, God waited until now and waited until me to really help you lucky people understand this passage. That's a huge thing. So whenever you find something like, I've got a new interpretation, be careful. It's not to say it is wrong. It's just, why would God reveal this to you when, thousands and thousands, millions of people have been studying this all along and that hasn't come out before? So he's probably not going to show you something he hasn't shown anyone else before. But our presuppositions are something that we have to be careful of. Our presuppositions are formed by our culture, which is very, very different from ancient culture in many, many kinds of ways. And so sometimes we have to kind of take our own cultural lenses off, put ourselves in that cultural world to sort of hear what is being said there. Okay, any questions? And we do have a microphone, or we'll have a microphone. Yeah. So we're doing this live stream, by the way. Questions, comments? Yes, Neil.
I have to be careful because I feel like whatever I say might indict myself about what I believe. So given that, my first question is, the idea of all Scripture is God-breathed, and yet all Scripture is written down by people, and in some cases written in our language, our vernacular, our background, our concepts. So when these people wrote things down and they spoke, I'll say in their figure of speech or their attitude, so to speak, does that mean that's how God would say it? Or does that mean, elder scriptures, God breathed, meaning he is agreeing with what's written down?
Yeah. So there are a couple different ways, or maybe there's a couple different schools of thought. One school of thought is that it is like automatic writing. Automatic writing is actually a New Age concept where you're filled with some kind of spirit. They take over your body. They possess you. You're not conscious. You're not aware. You are literally they're like a robot. Like they're controlling you to write what you're writing. Fascinatingly, the guy who invented the Enneagram, that's claimed that is how he received that information. Little known fact. So that is one understanding, and I would say probably for people coming from a more King James only perspective, that is what they would say. So they would then say, yes, how it is written is how God said it. Each and every single little word is the exact same. But then the question is, how far do you apply that, right? Well, if we apply that to the original, okay, but now we have a translation. We're reading an English translation. Does that same thing apply to the English text to the same degree? So one, I don't take that view personally that God took over their body, made their hand write what they wrote. I think God is aware when he chose the people that he wrote and when he inspired them to write. I think their personality, I don't think their personality detracts from what is being said. We often think of receiving things from God in a direct transmission kind of way, but there is always, with the exception of a few examples, there's always some kind of mediator in the middle of it. Whether it's a prophet, whether it's a text, something like this, God is speaking through someone to the rest of us. And so it's actually kind of built in, I would say, that there's this human component, that God is speaking through human vessels. The part where I would say we can have confidence in this is that it is the God side of that, right? It's not the human side that we have confidence in. They're just a person like any of us. It's the God side of this, of it's being breathed out by him and controlled by him. But it's like, I mean, when we pray for God to change someone's mind, you know, maybe there's a legal decision that we're wanting to happen or not happen, or a decision at work over our jobs, or something our kids are doing or thinking about or happening, and we pray for God to change our mind. Like, what are we asking him to do? Are we asking him to invade them, take over them, where they become kind of autonomous, like enter into factory setting mode for a few moments while they sign the paper that needs to be signed, or don't sign it, or whatever? Like, is that what we're asking God to do? And I would say no, we're not. Like that, I don't think that when God changes someone's mind, that's what happens. Personally, we're kind of like pretty deep philosophically here in terms of like what is the connection between the God portion of the revelation and what comes out. I would just say the gospel is never culturally bare. You'll hear people talk about interpreting the Bible and go, oh, we're trying to get to the transcultural principles. So like as an American, I need to be aware of my individualism. I need to be aware of my history, my past, all these kind of things. And so when I read the Bible, I'm reading through that lens. But now that I know that, I'm smart enough to take my culture out of that and to remove their culture out of it. And then I get to this transcultural truth, which is this kind of universal, all places, all people, all times kind of thing. And I would argue that that's impossible, and I would argue it's nonsense. Even me being aware of my presuppositions, it's impossible for me not to operate from them. And I would say God's created me to operate from them. Here's kind of where I see sort of a global church perspective being a beneficial thing. Or we just look at multi-denominations. I mean, it seems like each denomination has something that they're really, really good at. I mean, I think of like Presbyterian thinkers and writers. They are phenomenal. They're brilliant thinkers and writers. I would never want to go do outreach with them. It's not their thing. It's not their thing. Catholics also, brilliant thinkers and writers. You know, that whole don't have a wife and kids turns out to be like lots of great writing time. So like their books, I mean, they're just, I don't agree with their theology. I'm just saying from a scholastic standpoint, unmatched. Especially not gonna be matched by the Baptists who, you know, we take that be fruitful, multiply part very seriously. And that's, you know, what takes our time. And so I think that just from a denominational, take that how you want it. This is an adult crowd. This is theology after dark, heavy on the after dark. You know, so just looking at different denominations, it seems like, you know, with the Pentecostals, God has preserved the sense of zeal, and in some, he's preserved the sense of knowledge, and in some, the sense of action. And again, not to affirm like everyone's theological conclusions are the same or equally valid or whatever, but I think God looks down and sees a kind of kaleidoscope, and there's a lot less contradiction from his vantage point than from ours, perhaps. And so I would say the same thing. I think God is looking at John and his sense of irony, but he knew that when he called John as a disciple. And so we see times where, you know, the sons of thunder, you know, kind of get out of hand a little bit. But again, that's not God saying they're right. It's just accurately recording what they said. So I think the human component is factored into God's sovereignty over this whole process. Josh.
Brian, can you speak more about you mentioned that the Trinity is not explicitly maybe stated in the scriptures, or how did we come to a time where that term was introduced, and rather than having a different view of Jesus as the Son of God, maybe then interpreting that as a lesser God, rather than, and the Spirit being maybe another deity versus these being three in one?
Yeah, so I would say the term Trinity was not coined until much later in church history, but the concept was there very, very, very early on. At the same time, I would say you always had people who did not understand that fully. And to be fair to them, could just be that they didn't have access to all of the scriptures. I mean, even when I think back to my teenage days, learning to read the Bible, learning to study the Bible, we didn't have digital. I don't think I got my first digital concordance till Bible college. I mean, so in high school, I was still using Strong's, right? If you've ever used Strong's, everybody should have to do a couple of word studies in Strong's just to experience the pain that, the generations of Christians have experienced. Because it's like finding things in a phone book or it's just pages and pages and pages of turning and then looking up references. And so you go, okay, well, I'm not trying to put down people who maybe didn't have access to the same amount of scripture, or just even Strong's is a pretty great search tool to be able to find that. So my position is that the Trinity is both an Old Testament and a New Testament doctrine, though it doesn't go by that word in either testament. We see evidence of it throughout, and we see even the New Testament writers writing this out. So, John 1, Colossians 1, Philippians 2, Hebrews 1, these are the 4 chair passages for who is Jesus. And it starts tipping into these kind of Trinitarian conversations of he's one with God, he was there at creation, those other kind of things. At the same time, very early on, and this was, I mentioned, be careful of your presuppositions. Well, there's presuppositions from the ancient world as well. And so when people thought, well, we, because of Plato, think that the thought world, the reason world is higher than the material physical world, one becomes morally good and the other becomes morally bad. And so you're telling me that there's this Jesus person who's God, but then you said in the flesh, ooh, good things aren't in the flesh, because the flesh is actually bad. And so their whole world is this kind of moralistic, separated kind of thing. And so they were the ones who come along and go, well, Jesus can either be fully man, who was sort of adopted by God, or he's fully God, but not actually fully man. So he appeared to be human, So these were just different ways that they were trying to sort out, but oftentimes not reasoning necessarily from biblical evidence, more from reasoning from their own worldview and their own perspective. In the same way, a lot of people do this today. I can't believe in a God who, fill in the blank, right? This action is unpalatable to me and my modern sensitivity, so I can't believe in that God. And my response is, well, hang on. God either exists or he doesn't, right? It's either 100% or 0%. There's no, well, God exists. If he can check all of these boxes, then he exists. No, he either does or he doesn't. Now, if there is a God who in fact exists and then turns out to be maniacal, it would be best not to tick him off. Don't sit down here and be like, well, I can't believe in you because you're too mean. That sounds like a good way to get beat up. And so I think we kind of come to that, our modern perspectives, will God fit our expectations? But the first century had the same thing. For the non-Jewish audience, I don't want to follow a guy who's Jewish. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in the first century before there was ever Jesus. That was a thing that was before, that was during, that was after. And so, there were a lot of people just on the fact that Jesus was Jewish didn't want to follow him. I mentioned one of the early attempts at making a canon of scripture was Marcion, and Marcion didn't like the Jews. And so he kept Matthew out of his canon. He kept the whole Old Testament out of anything that was too Jewish. He just said, yeah, it's not biblical. So modern people can kind of do the same thing. A lot of these things were discussed at the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Chalcedon. One of these, I don't know if we do it as a summer nighttime series or something, but I would love for us to do going through some of the old creeds and that kind of stuff, because there's so much value in kind of hearing from our ancestors on what were they debating, how did they settle this out, why is this important. But if you're looking for kind of a place to go where it was more officially agreed upon of this is what we are saying, I would look at those two places. But what they are saying is, no, this was said all along. That's kind of the clarification that they were bringing to that conversation. So I think it's important for us to study those, but we would, again, just like we would say, well, the text was not, the church didn't have the authority to decide what the text was. It was a process of realization. I would say the same thing about these certain doctrines. What is God? Who is he really? How is that revealed to us, and how do we understand it? It's a difference of interpretation rather than inspiration. And so the opening quote from Bart Ehrman, he would say, well, if it doesn't fit this model, or if it seems to be up in the air, clearly it's not inspired. And I'll say, well, some of these seeming contradictions aren't a matter of was it inspired or even was it copied incorrectly. It's it's a matter of interpretation. How are we understanding these things? And you can interpret it as a contradiction, or you can look into the context and these other factors and go, actually, it's a paradox, maybe, or, but it's not a contradiction. All right, time for one more question.
So this may or may not surprise you, but I actually follow several textual critics and, listen to videos often. And the two Isaiahs thing isn't dead. They just pushed the date earlier, pre-Qumran. My question is actually, I was listening to one the other day, and he was calling into question Luke 1 and 2, which seems appropriate coming into the Christmas season. Just because of I believe because of the language being so different from the language used in the rest of Luke. Do you have anything to, say on? I know we've talked a lot about having texts that go back that far, but in those gaps when we see language changes, anything to that? Do you put anything there?
So first off, let me say there are a lot more interesting podcasts than ones on text criticism. Are you sleeping okay? Is that no? Joking aside, I don't personally take the whole language changing thing to be very valid, and some of this is based on how the Pentateuch has been taught. So one of the text critic-driven versions of how to understand the first 5 books of the Bible, it's JEDP is the 4 letters, and they represent. So one author, they call him the Yahwist, the J, and he uses that term a lot. And the next one uses Elohim a lot, and you have the Deutero one who's more on the law, and so like they each sort of get their editing process on the text, and then as this theory continues, it's you have like J1 and J2 and J. I mean, there's just more and more stuff, and so a lot of times text criticism is the stuff that dissertations are made of, and I know more than one person who goes, I don't even know if I really believe what I'm writing. I just have to write this for a project, and it's something I'm exploring and researching. It's like I'm talking about my research, but it's not necessarily that I agree with this. My kid brother is doing this. He's writing about the sea and how the Romans claimed the sea, and so at the end of time, where the sea is no more, that it's a statement against that. And to me, I find that very fascinating. And as he's telling me this, he can see me get excited because I was preaching Daniel at the time that he was telling me this. And he goes, whoa, I'm not saying like run into the pulpit with this fact. He said, I don't know this is a fact. He goes, it is interesting and I'm studying it. So a lot of things that other sort of popularizers will take as, I read this in a dissertation and it's fact. They might be mishearing what's being said. And it might be that this is just an intellectual curiosity that somebody has and is somewhat undetermined. More specifically, anyway, so I look at like the JEDP on the Pentateuch. We had a professor of Hebrew at Southeastern, John Selhammer, and he did this massive analysis of the Pentateuch. And he started looking at, it's called discourse analysis. So he started looking at what are the prefixes and suffixes, how are they used? And can we spot an author based on how they, kind of the twang in their voice, if you will. And essentially, he shows throughout the whole Pentateuch, linguistically, how while there might be various words selected and being used in one particular section or another, that prefixes, suffixes, essentially the accent is the same throughout. And so I look at that and I go, all right, there are certain differences that appear from one perspective that don't appear from another or like it appears like disunity here until you see it across the plane. So, I could think of things that I write from a blog post when my dad wanted to read my dissertation, I said, skip the first 40 pages. He goes, why? I said, it's all of the academic hyperspeak nonsense that they make you put in dissertation. It's just nonsense. It's, So I don't know. I would really have to study that out more to give you a more clear answer. I tend to take text criticism like a chicken, eat the meat and throw away the bones. And so I'm very quick to dismiss, even if I don't have a great academic reason for it, if it just doesn't seem sensical. And that's where I think a lot of these theories kind of come in. Again, it's the stuff that academic papers are made of, but just because you can write a paper doesn't mean that it's right. You can make a lot of cases about a lot of things, but then you have to go, well, why would it happen that way? Does that make any sense? Would people take time to fix this, so to speak? I look at it and I go, well, there's several sections in Paul's writings where he's quoting the language dramatically changes. It shifts to poetry. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. That's because of its kind of lyrical quality in Greek, people think that's actually one of the earliest hymns, and Paul is simply quoting, like someone might do mid-sermon, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." Just kind of throwing out something that they would have known as well. So I don't see a shift in language itself to be an indicator that it's a different author or something different. That's me personally. All right, I'll hang out if anybody has any more questions or wants to chat about this, but thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it.